President Gorbachev and Mrs. Thatcher have begun their main session of talks at Downing Street. The two leaders are covering East-West relations, arms control, human rights and the Middle East, building on the exchanges which began at Heathrow Airport last night. Michael Brunson, our political editor, reports.
As Mr. Gorbachev's vast ZIL limousine turned into Downing Street, Mrs. Thatcher stepped outside to meet her guest. A special touch this, it doesn't happen all that often. It meant she was also able to oversee the taking of the first of the morning's many pictures. Leading Mr. Gorbachev inside, there was the small business of the Soviet president's overcoat to deal with. There was indeed quite a bit of mournful small talk about the dreadful weather. Far more important, of course, are the words now being exchanged away from the cameras on the wider issues of nuclear weapons, with disagreement expected about NATO's need to modernize some of them, and disagreement expected too over human rights, both in the Soviet Union and, Mr. Gorbachev will point out, in Northern Ireland. But at the start of the meeting, all the emphasis was on agreement and friendship, underlined by the rare sight and sound of the Downing Street staff applauding a Soviet visitor. Mrs. Thatcher, as she often does when welcoming people to number 10, pointed out that there's a picture of every British Prime Minister there's ever been on the walls here.
Everyone says. From 1732.
Ahead of the two leaders for the rest of this morning, much ground to cover, for as well as arms control and human rights, they'll talk about the Middle East, where both want to see a real move towards peace. And after the one-to-one talks held in the Downing Street study, there will also be a wider meeting and the signing of 3 agreements, one of which involves British help in building a new school in Armenia. Mr. Gorbachev will know all too well that Armenia is still recovering from the effects of that terrible earthquake.
While her husband continues his talks at number 10, Raisa Gorbachev is enjoying a somewhat lighter schedule. Amid tight security, she began a sightseeing tour of London with a visit to St. Paul's Cathedral. Education Secretary Kenneth Baker, whom she first met in Moscow, was on hand to show her round. Later, Mrs. Gorbachev will go on to see Tower Bridge and the Museum of London. Labour leader Neil Kinnock is demanding a common statement into what he says is new evidence in the Westmoreland Affair. He says he cannot really see why President Gorbachev's visit interferes with her ability to be in the Commons at question time this afternoon. The former Trade and Industry Minister, Sir Leon Brittan, admitted that the leak of a vital letter which led to his resignation was approved by Downing Street, but he says that's nothing new. He says the Prime Minister's Press Secretary, Bernard Ingham, knew what was going on. Scotland Yard has confirmed it's begun a major investigation into palace security following the alleged theft of private letters belonging to the Princess Royal. The palace says the 4 letters, which were offered to the Sun newspaper, were probably taken from one of the royal residences. Police and mountain rescue teams searching for 5 girl guides missing in the North Yorkshire Dales since last night found them a short time ago. In Alaska, the tanker Exxon Valdes has been refloated and towed in for temporary repairs. In New York, the ship's captain was charged with being under the influence of alcohol. Bail was set at £300,000. In the city, trading's been opened with dealers in downbeat mood. On the foreign exchanges, the pound is a shade up against the dollar. And there'll be more on the Gorbachev visit at just before 10:20 this morning. But I'll be back at 10:55 with the headlines during this morning.
Good morning. A major report on the state of schools in Newham, the country's second most deprived area, blames teachers' union activities for pupils' underachievement. The National Foundation for Educational Research took 18 months to compile the study. It recommends better management, more staff development and closer monitoring of the quality of education. But Malcolm Horn from the National Union of Teachers says the government's to blame.
I believe if you speak to teachers in Newham, and I know many teachers in Newham, that they would say that they have far too large classes in which to be able to give individual attention to children that they need. and that they haven't got the resources, and that wouldn't be entirely Newham's fault. The government has clamped down very severely on resources to the London Borough of Newham, and they have much to answer for.
A campaign to improve the standard and quality of public transport in the capital is being launched by the Democrats. As Barbara Long reports, they're calling for increased public investment to help beat London's snarl-ups.
Commuters arriving at Waterloo this morning were met by balloon-festooned, clipboard-toting Democrats after their signatures. The party's transport spokesman, Matthew Taylor, says London will grind to a halt unless the government invests more money in public transport.
Ultimately, I think that London grinding to a halt is the only option to proper investment in transport, and one way or another, therefore, I think that we will see money put in. I'd just rather see it before we get to the crisis point.
The Democrats will be outside other London stations in the weeks ahead. They want 100,000 signatures to back their campaign.
A policeman was injured and 4 cars were damaged as armed officers hunting a violent escaped prisoner arrested 2 men in Basildon last night. A woman was also detained in a raid on a flat in Harlow, but the search is continuing for 31-year-old Patrick Tate, who's facing robbery and drugs charges. He escaped from Billericay Magistrates Court last year. Detectives are still questioning a man in connection with the murder of 2 security guards burned to death in a Soho amusement arcade on Monday. 4 people were doused in petrol, then set alight. New guidelines on how to protect teachers and pupils while building work is carried out in schools are being issued to local authorities today. The guidelines were drawn up after a series of accidents in schools 3 years ago. In the past 2 years, there have been 16 deaths and 587 serious injuries. Peter Ward from the Health and Safety Commission says he hopes the advice will increase awareness about the role of authorities in ensuring greater safety.
They do know anyway. They ought to know. It's just that they don't do it. They take shortcuts on occasions. And if by doing so that's a shortcut to the death of a child, then that's what we've got to stop.
Are you laying blame on the shoulders of educational authorities for these children's
No, I
injury
don't
and
think
death?
particularly. It's true that some education authorities have tackled this better than others have. And what we've tried to do is to bring together the best practices from education authorities so that everybody moves up to the same high level.
Vandals are being blamed for a goods train derailment which ripped up 300 yards of track at British Rail's depot in Barking in Essex. Firefighters are battling to rescue a man who's trapped down a 30-foot hole in Hampton. He's believed to have fallen down the hole in Lower Sunbury Road just before 9 this morning. Fire crews are using a crane to haul him out. It's understood Thames Water Authority have been carrying out work in the area. And finally, the Thames weather. The rest of the day will be cold with outbreaks of rain, maximum temperatures 6 Celsius. And that's it. We're back at 11:55. Join us then.